Good evening, and welcome to Talking Popcorn and Accent Elimination, a lecture by Nina Katchadourian about her own work. My name is Catherine Babayan, and I'm the director of the Armenian Studies program, and I'm thrilled that we're able to invite, together with our partner, the Institute for the Humanities, Nina Katchadourian, here for a talk and an exhibit coupled together. Please do remember that there's a reception in the Thayer building in the Institute of the Humanities right after the talk, and please join us there. I would also like to thank Amanda Kruglik, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, who is the inspiration behind this invitation, and it's been always a thrill and a pleasure to work with you. So thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Naira Tumanyan, the programmer for the Armenian Studies program, who always makes things seamlessly possible for us to be here. Nina Katchadourian is an artist who works across many media and disciplines, whether through videos, photographs, sculptures, or performance. She comments on geography, the natural sciences, psychology, language, and translation. Her video, Accent Elimination, which opened today at the Institute for the Humanities, was included at the 2015 Venice Biennial in the Armenian Pavilion, and it won the Golden Lion for Best National Participation. She has had many exhibitions in key museums from New York to Paris to Tokyo and Istanbul. I will not read you the list, but instead I will say that it has been really a treat getting to know her work in preparation for my introduction. It is playful, it is funny, and it's impulsive. Nina Katchadourian is a collector of everyday objects, things like maps, insects, animals, and accents, all material that she makes sense of in an unfamiliar way, challenging what seems to our trained eyes and ears and minds as the order of things, the way in which things must fit together. As Katchadourian sorts and mismatches material together, misunderstandings and incongruities connect literally, physically, and emotionally. Seemingly incompatible objects and sounds, like car alarms resembling bird cars, or the sound of popping corn deciphered to the Morse code turned into speech. How we see or hear, who gets to see and hear, what are the right forms of seeing and hearing? In other words, how we engage with the world around us is a question of human psychology that Katchadourian plays with at the intersection of visuality, cognition, and power. For her, I think, it is the process of getting to understand the complexity of the thing itself, our relationship to it, and our experience of it that matters. The awkwardness of the encounter is at times frustrating, but confusion is productive for Katchadourian because things that don't quite fit together strangely turn out to cohere and overlap. In this process of self-inquiry, the viewer too gets confused, feels uneasy with the kinds of alignments that are counterintuitive. Thwarting efforts to categorize, to define, and to know, Katchadourian challenges our human impulse to understand the complexity of nature and experiencing it in absolute terms. In her Accent Elimination, created in 2005, the concept of foreign accents and how they confuse identity marks the experience of removing her parents' natural accents, who already have confusing identities, right? A father who was born speaking Armenian or born Armenian in contemporary Turkey, and then who moved with his family after the genocide to Beirut, Lebanon, and spoke Arabic. And also the story of her mother, which is not less complicated, but one who was born into a Swedish minority group living in Finland. Inspired by posters advertising courses in accent elimination, she worked with her parents and professional speech improvement coach to neutralize her parents' accent and then to learn to speak in their accent. As you will see and hear from Katchadourian, a range of awarenesses come out of this encounter. Who hears and marks the foreign? How does the foreign get domesticated without losing the self in this process? Difficulties in accessing each other's accents end up with an odd mixture of inflections and tones where all three start mixing their own accents and sound distortedly different. In accent elimination, Katchadourian problematizes the politics of accents and language. Her artistic impulse puts the audience in an uneasy distance, and as well the participants, between the foreign and the home, calling for the ethical necessity to reconsider what is natural and what is universal. Please join me in welcoming Nina Katchadourian.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for that I learned a lot from that introduction, actually. Appreciate it so much. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for coming, everybody. I have a lot of things I'm going to try to fit in tonight. And the piece that I usually start with when I give an artist talk is accent elimination. So I'm not going to screen it because you can go see it. And I think what I will do instead is just tell you a little bit about the backstory and try to kind of contextualize it for you. So if you do go, you'll know a little bit about what you're looking at. So as Catherine mentioned, I have parents who come from very different parts of the world. It's sort of a crazy thing that they ever met. They were set up by a mutual friend who knew my father when he was living in Beirut and who knew my mother from when she had studied abroad at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. And being the matchmaker that she is, she sort of thought these two people would like each other and convinced my mother to come and work for my father as a research assistant. And the story is that they fell in love on the way home from the airport, got engaged 3 weeks later, and they're still happily married 52 years later. So sometimes these things work out. They've always said to me, please don't do that to us. And I didn't. But so they come from wildly different parts of the world. They are both one thing they have in common is that they're both from small cultures within larger cultures within small countries. So to make a long, complicated story short, my father is ethnically Armenian, but grew up in Beirut and have parents who grew up speaking Turkish with one another, but spoke Armenian with him, and on it goes. My mother is from Finland, but she is from a minority group within Finland who are known as the Finland Swedes, and that means that they speak Swedish, a different dialect of Swedish than what's spoken in Sweden, and identify as Finnish. So it's this kind of situation has been present for me my whole life, kind of combinations of places, languages that are sort of in between one thing and another. My mother is also a literary translator, which has, I'm sure, had some impact on my own sense of language, translation, mistranslation, themes that come up a lot in my own work. And I've grown up very close to my parents, so it has always been a source of tremendous frustration that I have never been able to imitate their accents. I cannot do it. And my brother and I would try as kids, we would end up sounding like, phony Russian spies, more or less, and it was, maddening. We just couldn't get it right. When I moved to New York, in 1996, so it's 20 years now, I noticed these posters that advertised a service called accent elimination. And this was a very curious term. It sounded mildly violent, like someone was going to, show up with like a spray thing and like the way it would kill bugs, I guess. And I called up one of these coaches and just said, I'm curious about what this is, how it works, and who does it, and why. And he was a very smart guy, and he gave me a very informed and careful answer to, in that he said, this is not about eradicating someone's culture, this is not about people being ashamed of where they're from and trying to be different. It's about clear communication. And they, people who feel like they're not being understood effectively at work or in their professional lives come to me, and I help them kind of speak in a way that's easier to understand. But I mean, to me, this whole question of what it would mean to eliminate your accent raised all kinds of interesting questions about assimilation and about what I see as a very American, curious paradox, which is that on one hand, there's this kind of narrative about be proud of where you're from and know your roots, and on the other hand, it's all about sort of everybody's here together, let's all fit in, and melting pot and all the rest of it. So I'm interested in that tension in this piece. And the task at hand was that my parents and I would work together with this speech coach in order for him to teach me how to speak with each of my parents' accents, separate accents, and for them to learn how to speak so-called standard American English. Sam, our coach, in this picture here, wonderful, wonderful guy who I'm sad to say passed away about 6 years ago now. He had this fantastic office, super messy, piled up with books. I couldn't move the camera any further back from his desk than that because there was literally just a wall of stuff behind me on the floor. He grew up in deepest Brooklyn and had, to my ear, a Brooklyn accent. And so from the beginning, we were in this kind of conversation about even how the English words should be pronounced. I mean, none of this was sort of simple any step of the way. And what we did with him is we would sit down and take lessons every other day. This was a typical situation, mom having a lesson with Sam. And Sam would correct the lines, make her pronounce things again, explain to her her set of vowel and consonant sounds and how they sort of needed to be shifted to sound more American. And on the days in between lessons, we went back to my studio and practiced and practiced and practiced more. So this is now mom in the hot seat in my messy studio and me off camera correcting her lines so that she can pronounce her words more like me, and then we would switch places and do it all over again. So, this often resembled a kind of curious type of strange family therapy. I often say it was, we sat down with a stranger who knew neither of us, and he was trying to sort of explain us to one another. It's one of the hardest skills I've ever tried to learn, to speak with someone else's accent, and even maybe particularly to speak with one of my parents' accents. The accent to me sits in this place where it's of the body, it comes out of the body, it's in that sense very physical, even almost material, but of course it is not that. It is this ethereal, immaterial, curious thing. And any of you who have ever worked with your voice, if you've studied singing or you've studied any kind of like oration, I guess, you know how weird it is to control your own sound. It sits in such a strange place. So we are working from a script. You can see it there in the foreground. And the script was two scripts. The scripts were written by each of my parents. And what I said to them was basically, can you please write for me the typical conversation that happens if you go to like a cocktail party and someone gets curious about where you're from. What kind of name is Katchadourian? Oh, interesting, Armenian. Well, you don't look Armenian. This is, my mother always gets this. You don't look Armenian. Well, actually, I'm, Finnish. And Finland, but I'm actually Swedish within this Finnish thing. And the questions kind of just keep coming. And so they wrote these two scripts, and we are trying to learn our lines with me playing the part of the curious stranger and them playing themselves. And as you'll see, if you see the piece, we start by speaking in our natural accents, and by the end of the piece, we've tried to kind of switch and flip the accents so that we're speaking in each other's accents. And it is definitely not a project which is about our stupendous success with this task. It is a project about our intense struggle with this task and the kind of awkwardness that erupts along the way, the intimacy, I think, that's visible in the attempt to do this, and the slipperiness of the accent, the whole question of what an accent is, physically and materially, I guess, too. I had the very wonderful experience of getting to show this piece, as Catherine mentioned, at the Venice Biennial this past summer, and there's so much to say about this experience, but the exhibition itself was held on this island called San Lazzaro, which is about 10 minutes from the island of Venice. So we were as if in this kind of time-warped world on this little island off of the coast of an ancient city where there was this Armenian monastery still inhabited by, about a dozen, I think, monks who were there walking around. absolutely beautiful place and immaculately well kept, and the exhibition was sort of, you know, installed into the spaces of the monastery where they have a lot of beautiful and important Armenian historical artifacts. My piece, you know, it's never ever been shown anywhere other than a sort of white cube art space, so it was fascinating for me to see it in a context like this, and such an interesting experience to be part of this show, which was a show curated around the idea of a diasporic group of artists. None of us were from Armenia at all. We were all from the diaspora. So there were Brazilian Armenians and Egyptian Armenians and Canadian Armenians, Syrian Armenians, Lebanese Armenians, you know, 30 of us in all. And such an interesting conversation to have with these artists about, you know, their Armenianness and, or in my case, you know, my half Armenianness and sort of what we knew of our families and what the stories were, and this kind of odd feeling of like a family reunion because we all sort of looked like each other. So there's so much to say about it, but I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to talk more about it too. So that's a little bit about the kind of Armenian side of me. And now there's the Finnish side, which has its own impact on the work that I make as well. And I should say I usually don't give talks that are so autobiographical, but it sort of felt like the thing to do for this show, for this lecture. So my mother is from Finland, up there. I have grown up spending every summer on a small island cluster off the south coast of Finland in this enormous archipelago that Finland has that stretches all the way from the south coast across to Sweden in the west. We're zooming in here. And this place is really kind of my favorite place on the planet. I stay in this tiny little round house when I'm there. That's actually an old World War II soldier's hut. It's like living in a water tower. It's one round room. And this picture, to me, has the kind of, it communicates the kind of elfin scale that everything there exists on for me. Like, I always feel like I'm living this kind of world in miniature when I'm there. And I know this place incredibly well. I know it to sort of, you know, every stone and pebble and blade of grass there is somehow very familiar to me. And my family, my parents and my brother and I really spend time there every year. It's sort of the one time that we're all together every year. I grew up learning how to feed the birds with my grandfather. There's me and my brother, my grandfather smashing peanuts for the birds. And there are all these pictures in the family album of us sort of hunched over things, like planting things or pulling out weeds, or here we're relocating a tree, like these kind of manicuring nature gestures in curious ways. And I crawled around a lot in trees and on the ground and explored. And all of this, I think, was a way of learning how to pay attention to little things. This is a spread from my family album that my mother has captioned, Watching Small Things with Nini. That was what we called my mother's mother. And here we are kind of like learning how to be quiet and, you know, learning how to look carefully at little things. And it was a method of attentiveness, I guess, that I think I really learned from them. And it has led to projects that have happened in Finland, have been made in Finland, like this one. Where I sort of did the same thing. I spent a lot of time in the forest looking at stuff, noticed that a lot of spider webs looked kind of crappy and broken, and went out to see if I could repair one with red sewing thread and little tweezers and sewing scissors, and I just wanted to see what would happen. Could I do it? What would happen if I did do it? And what happened was that the spider came back that night and tore out all the patches and threw them away. And I found them on the ground, which actually really at that point is when it got interesting. The gesture alone of me fixing wasn't really so interesting to me until this rejection happened. And then we were into this battle of one-upmanship where, you know, we could say like the spider was refusing me and I was sort of saying, you're doing it wrong. And we had this kind of competitive relationship that began to develop. I like to think of it as sibling rivalry, actually. So I did a lot of these repaired patches that summer. Spiders often build webs on, well, I chose the webs where spiders had built on human structures as a way of sort of connecting our two different habitats as well. This was my field repair kit that I made, and once had the pleasure of traveling with just after 9/11 when they were confiscating sharp objects, and I'd kind of forgot about that rule because it was still a new rule, and the person said, they found this in my bag and said, what is this? And I got to say, it's a spiderweb repair kit. And answered the question. This is called Marketing Tips for Spiders, which is an attempt to teach a spider how to advertise. I made a video called Gift, which, if you were to pronounce this word gift in Swedish, which, by the way, is the language that I grew up speaking at home with my mother and still speak with her. So gift means poison, as it does in German too, and I think Dutch maybe as well. G-I-F-T made out of small red letters, and the spider, after I had inserted these letters, rushed in and began to try to yank the letters out. So we wind up in this kind of 10-minute battle of me trying to get the letters in, it trying to pull the letters out. I wanted a word that would communicate the fact that I was sort of giving it something, but not something it particularly wanted. I raided the family tool shed that summer too. I found a box of bicycle tire patches that I applied to a mushroom that had little tears in it and created this kind of garish job. And I was interested in these as deliberately intrusive acts. It was really not, in some ways at all, about being kind of nice to the spider. It was about being a little out of line and being a little bit out of line and also ill-equipped to do the job well. So the limitations of my dexterity are important. This is called transplant. This was a bunch of leaves that were missing from this plant and then a bunch of dead insect wings that I took off of some dead bugs in the house and put onto the plant. And it's not a really great repair job. They're clumps of glue and I'm at the limits of what my fingers can manage, but I wanted that to show. I conscripted some tadpoles and made them swim around an egg because I thought that would look like that textbook picture of when life begins, and I made a lot of photos like that as well. All of these things were really done in this spirit of playing around the way that I would have done when I was a kid there, and sort of not ruling out any game, not ruling out any possibility, and trying to sort of take the play seriously. And I talk about this a lot, that I'm a great believer in play and the usefulness of experimentation in that kind of spirit, but it's not enough to kind of just stop at that moment of sort of, wow, you know, how fun. Like, it has to be done, I think, with a kind of rigorous follow-through, or it doesn't really get you anywhere. And two of my most hated words recently actually have become whimsical, and what's the other one? I can't believe I don't remember it. I'll rant about it, I'm sure, before I'm done talking tonight. But you know, whimsy is nice, but whimsy doesn't imply that you've had any intentionality there either. And so I sort of feel like that's the trick. You have to kind of start and maybe not know what you're doing, and then at a certain point you know more about what you're doing because you've been doing it, and you sort of have a through line that you see through. So I've gotten to do a couple of really wonderful residencies over the years. Not that many, but every 5 years it seems I kind of get to do one that is pretty special. And this year, the year I'm going to talk about was 2001, and I got to go to the island nation of Trinidad. This is a picture of the capital city, Port of Spain, which was this bustling, busy place. I mean, I think when I told friends I was going on a residency to the Caribbean, they thought I'd be sitting on a beach the whole time, and this was almost like parts of Port of Spain reminded me of the craziest parts of New York City. And that was fantastic, but I also already lived somewhere like that, so I wanted to get away from the city and see other kinds of things. And unbeknownst to me, Trinidad turns out to be this birding paradise. People go there to look at birds, and I started making these field trips to see things like the scarlet ibis, which is this type of bird that eats little red crabs, and it turns this amazing color and flies around like red arrows in the sky. It was stupendous. I also visited a small town on the north coast where that pin is to see these leatherback turtles that are highly endangered and come up on the beaches to lay eggs in the middle of the night in certain seasons of the year. And I got to see a big giant turtle come up in the middle of the night, dig a hole, lay her eggs, and then another day I got to see a nest of eggs hatch and little turtles exploding all over the sand. And you know, these were just sort of stupendous experiences for me. I took a hike one day with a guide to go up to this waterfall, deep, deep, deep in the forest. And while we were standing there taking a breather, I heard a sound. It was very familiar to me, and I stood there trying to identify it, and as one does, kind of, you know, going through what the possibilities might be. And I finally knew what it was, and I identified it for myself as a car alarm, which had been wildly wrong, because this is where I was. There were no cars, no roads, no car alarms, nothing of the sort, and it turned out that what I had heard was actually a bird. And then that got interesting to me, because I thought, I've basically cross-wired this sound from my urban environment at home with a sound from this place, which is anything but urban. And, you know, what does that mean about sound? What does it mean about the natural? What does it mean about, you know, this whole question of sort of what belongs where sonically. And I decided to take this error and basically work with it as the starting point for a piece called Natural Car Alarms. I really like mistakes. I think mistakes and moments of deep confusion are very productive, highly creative moments. And that when we sort of try to, when we're wildly lost, when we're wildly confused, and we try to sort of think our way back to sense, we do a lot of reckless and very creative thinking. It's sort of like you're trying to throw meaning at something to kind of make it work out again. And I have to say, I often feel a little mildly disappointed when things kind of like lock back into the known positions. But before they do, for me, I'm often just trying to keep it kind of all the pieces in the air. And this moment of hearing the sound was kind of like that. So I made a piece called Natural Car Alarms. It was commissioned by Sculpture Center in New York City in 2001, and it consisted of, or 2002, and it consisted of this fleet of cars that had window decals, bird silhouettes, the type you'd see in birding books, a decal on the back that advertised that this car was protected by natural car alarms, a very homemade system under the hood, and people would come up and try to kind of provoke the cars into making these strange sounds, which didn't work because they were actually running on timers to make sure that there was an alarm event every now and then. And I'll play you what some of these sound like. So I worked with the Macaulay Library of Natural Sound at Cornell, at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is an amazing place. If you've never been on their website, even if you're not interested in birds, I highly recommend procrastinating for half an hour sometime and doing that, because they have the world's largest archive of animal sounds, and they've recently put all of it online. It's an amazing resource, and they agreed to work with me on this. I sent them a recording of a car alarm from down the street, and then I got this amazing CD back in the mail a few weeks later with about 35 birds that they thought sort of roughly, you know, had the feeling of car alarms. And from there, then I edited the alarms, not by changing the bird sounds at all. I didn't speed anything up or slow anything down or add filters or change the sonic qualities of it, but I did change the pacing so that that would sort of create those staccato patterns that people are used to hearing. So in many ways, I love the excuse and the opportunity to sort of step away from the art world and sort of move into places where people are doing very different kinds of research. And I mean, I think this has become a very common way of working. This is certainly not my own unique strategy, but there have been many public projects like that one over the years, many also involving, or a couple involving cars. This was the largest scale project I've ever done for Insight in 1994, which is an installation festival that happens in San Diego, between San Diego and Tijuana. It was a collaborative project. And Mark and Stephen were two good friends of mine in grad school, and we were all young artists, and we hadn't made that much work yet. And I think collaboration is a wonderful thing. It makes you brave. It makes you do things you would never attempt alone, and that was certainly the case with this piece for us. And in some ways, you know, we really didn't have enough experience to know better, which is also why it was great that this piece kind of happened at all, because we were like, why not try it? And the why not try it had to do with the idea that we would make a piece on the site of this community college, and the piece was going to be to organize all the cars that came to school that day by color in these enormous parking lots that ring the school. We were struck by the fact that all the buildings at the middle of campus is where, you know, that's where the action took place. That's what people were driving to school to do and to see. And why not think about this huge peripheral zone around those buildings where people were also spending time, even though they were they didn't count the parking lots somehow. So we devised this scheme, which involved going and counting hundreds of cars on weekends in shopping malls and trying to sort out sort of which percentage of cars were which colors. We had to deal with parking lots of very different sizes at the school, and also really felt strongly we didn't want this piece to sort of be like we were foisting it on the community of this school. So we did a lot of PR before the event to kind of let people know something was about to happen without sort of revealing all of it. This flyer went on the car a few days before the event, so people would know the best way to get to school and where ideally they should park. And then we basically, with the help of 50 volunteers, directing traffic for us, held our breath and wound up with this kind of crazy situation the day of these intensely colored parking lots, which weren't all the same color, as you notice. The red is my favorite color, but red had a lot of very nice variations to it. 13% of cars in 1994 in San Diego were red. 17% of cars in 1994 in San Diego were white. This was the largest parking lot of them all. No one could find their car at the end of the day, which was unfortunate. People were generally very good-natured about that. So we had 14 colors in all: yellow, blue. This is a shot from the small two-seater plane of the president's of the school's plane. He was an amateur pilot and took us up to take pictures. Lucky for us. This is the red, the blue, and the overflow lot. Red, white, and overflow. And you'll notice here, where is it? Here, you've got a white car in the red lot. And there were really nice moments where the system broke down that were actually some of my favorite unexpected things about what happened. That was one where sort of the rules didn't work and people just insisted on parking somewhere, which we sort of said, that's totally fine. Park where you want to. It'll be easiest if you park where we ask you to. But and the other nice thing was, after the piece was over, watching this ordered thing sort of go back into shuffled randomness. And we documented everything as furiously as we could. This is the whole campus. So there were something like 5,000 parking spots, and I think traffic must have turned over at least once, maybe twice for some of those spaces. So I have never had any part of displacing this much matter before, and never since. It was a very weird, interesting experience, and really nerve-wracking and really thrilling. I wanted to talk about this public project because it is a project that is very timely right now. We are obviously in an election year, as no person who's in their right mind could not know right now. In 2008, I had been invited to come to the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art to propose a project for them on their 10-year anniversary show, which was supposed to be a show about humor. I never make things that are intentionally funny. That's sort of not the point. It's fine with me if things are funny. I think humor is often a good way into something. It tends to be a way of sort of drawing people close and then doing something different sometimes. But I've never tried to make something funny. So this was a very hard commission for me. I got to Scottsdale, and all I could think about were tragic things. All I could think about were, the decimation of the Native Americans and like this horrible history that existed in this part of the country, but country at large, about all these people who sort of weren't there anymore. And I was sinking sort of deeper and deeper into these topics that were not funny much. And at the same time, trying to pay attention to what was there, was struck by how many of these election signs were cropping up all over town. In the case of the Scottsdale landscape, they were cropping up in places like vacant lots on the sides of freeways and roads. And there's a certain kind of graphic design aesthetic to these signs that's interesting. They're sort of, not really good design exactly. There's a vernacular that's very interesting. They're meant to, I think, they're meant to be quickly readable, but there's something like they're not over-designed. It's very interesting to me it was very interesting to start thinking about why they look that way. And then I did start thinking more about this kind of serious response to what I was thinking about US history there, and I thought, all of these names that you see here, some of them go to be kind of part of history, and some just disappear, and you never think about these people anymore. They don't win the election, like they're kind of lost in some stream. And I thought, I want to make a piece that looks at this country's entire election history. And I'll design a set of political signs that have the names of everybody on them who ever ran for the office of president and lost. And that'll be sort of like our collective road not taken. And then I'll design all these signs in a current day vernacular style. They'll be made like current day election signs on coroplast, which is that kind of like corrugated plastic material. And we did that, and we set this piece up in 3 different sites in Scottsdale. And this was my favorite of the 3 sites. This was just a residential home. One of the museum employees agreed to let me do this to her house, and set up all these signs where, you know, you would drive by and sort of think like some political nutcase lives here who, you know, doesn't know what year it is and is voting for what the hell, you know, what these names come up again. And one thing that was interesting to me was that while we were installing this, people came up and sort of made comments, and I heard comments from people who were definitely going to vote Democrat and other people who were definitely going to vote Republican, and everyone sort of thought the piece was in sort of favor of their view. Like one guy said, I know what you're talking about. You're saying that anyone would be better to elect than the guy, you know, we just elected. This was after Obama won the first election. And anyway, I hope this piece sort of sat in an ambiguous place politically that way, that you could kind of feel happy or sad about any one of the signs. Here it is at the Aldrich Museum in Connecticut, in front of this very, you know, colonial house on Main Street, looking similarly, you know, double take, I hope. I got to show it in the windows of the Washington Post headquarters in DC in 2012, and that was interesting because there was this news ticker. So you had a sort of reminder of like very much the here and now as the signs were talking about the past. I'm crossing my fingers really hard right now that there's going to be a New York venue for it this next time around, and I'm too jinxy-minded to tell you where it might be, but please cross your fingers for me that this happens. It would be great to get to show it again, and we'll see. I plan to have, what I'd like to do is show it before the election and then have it stay up after the election, and when we determine who the loser is, we add one more sign that day. So we'll see what happens. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this, and oops, actually I did skip over this, I just left an old slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about talking popcorn. This is also an extension of this ongoing interest in language and translation. So in grad school, I took a class that was called Music, Flight, and Morse Code. And this was kind of like a dream course for me when I saw it on the books. It was a music department course. It was taught by a guy who had been a pilot and then became a composer and had learned Morse code as part of his sort of, I guess, aviation training, which is kind of funny. But I've always loved the sound of Morse code. And as a kid in Finland, in the summers, we used to turn on the shortwave radio and hear ships communicating with each other using Morse code. You can still sort of catch that now and then there. But I loved the fact that the staccato language that sounded so musical to me could also be telling you something if you knew how to listen to it right. And so this sort of always stuck with me. And when I saw that course in graduate school, I immediately took it. Our final was in Morse code, so you had to knock out the answers to the professor when he knocked out the questions to you. The most memorable final exam I've ever taken or given. And I developed this fantasy that if you were really good at Morse code, potentially anything in the world with a staccato pattern could be telling you something. And I thought if that was the case, you know, popcorn would be saying a lot of stuff because it has that kind of irregular on again, off again quality. And I thought I should make a piece that decodes the talking of popcorn. And then I thought, I have no idea how I would do that, and basically just shuttled the idea to the side and found that 8 years later I was still thinking about it and really wanted to do something about it. So I ended up finding a computer programmer, a wonderful guy named Josh Goldberg, who wrote this beautiful Max MSP patch that does this listening and decoding process. So you encounter the popcorn machine looking like this, sort of cheerful, circusy. I always have the wall near it painted that blue color. It's always on that red circle. You press a button. That's the Morse code language in case you've never seen it. You press the button, it pops popcorn, and then this simultaneous spoken translation occurs, which sounds like this.
Utarajat. Jihex muti. Utami. I. Kisai. Hi thimisexit. E.
So it's very gibberishy, as you can hear. It does not speak English. I didn't want it to. I wanted it to speak what it speaks. So there is a way in which when you listen to it, you're always projecting meaning into it. You hear words, you hear it. I mean, it started talking to me with all kinds of stuff. It asked me one day, do you ski? It called me mom. It you know, kept coming up with these things, you know, all of it obviously my own projection. But it was important to me somewhere in this piece to also have a text readout that you could experience as a text. So there's a popcorn journal that tracks the daily speech of the popcorn machine, and you can read it, and you can also actually see that now and then it does say mom, for example, and all kinds of things in other languages, in fact, not just English. You could search for languages you may speak. I bronzed its first kernels spoken because it called me mom, and so did that. The first word it ever said was we, ... So this was sort of presented in this overly precious way. And then this really awful thing happened, which was that I was showing it in Houston at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in a show there. And I'd gone there and set it up. We had a very nice opening. The tradition has become that I pop popcorn at the opening, everybody gets to eat the words, and it's festive and nice. And I went back to New York, and I got a phone call from the curator with very bad tone of voice, saying something really awful has happened. I don't know how to tell you this, but the popcorn machine caught on fire and has burnt itself to death. And she emailed me this picture, which was like seeing, you know, a car crash for me. And horrible, and it's still a little mysterious what happened. We think there was some kind of a short in the speaker cabling at the top. The popcorn machine was not making popcorn, it wasn't on, there was no heat in the system. Thank God no one was hurt, thank God the building didn't burn down. Even work around it, even my own work nearby wasn't affected by it, but you know, lots of fire extinguisher powder stuff and total mess and completely, you know, self-immolated. So in the first week or two after this happened, when I told friends this story, I got that question a lot of like, well, what did it say? Like, what was the last word? And, you know, this was not initially amusing to me because this thing had been calling me mom and I was very attached to it. But I do in fact know what it said because the computer survived the fire. So Talking Popcorn's last words were this. And I have been intending for a long time now to make something that engages this text. I mean, I'd like to give this text to people who translate in different kinds of ways. Maybe a code breaker, maybe some kind of police, you know, I don't know, FBI person, or, you know, computer code scrambler, descrambler, I don't know, encryption expert is what I'm trying to say. There are all kinds of people who might have an opinion about what this text really means. A French francophone friend of mine pointed out that if you kind of take this up in French, and you read this as "ça suffit," it's sort of like, I've had enough. And I really like that interpretation. So, I don't know, if you have ideas, if you have other interpretations of this, I would love to hear them. And then I made another popcorn machine. And when it began to speak again, this is what it produced as its first phrase. So there's sort of now these two bookended texts that I'd like to, at some point, work with. I was happy here that actually one of its first words was, again, hi. So that was kind of nice. It came back. And here's the new popcorn machine, which I decided should have a sort of different voice, a younger voice, because it is younger. And it speaks a little like a sort of cheerful child to me. So, in a way, all of these projects, I guess what they have in common for me is that they are about a kind of desire for things to make sense, to be meaningful, that kind of goodwill moment where we, maybe many of you have had this experience. You're speaking to someone in a language that you don't speak that well, and you're really hoping you're having the same conversation. You're sort of throwing a lot of meaning, extra meaning into this to kind of find a way to connect, to talk. And I mean, I know there are very many ways to be kind of skeptical, and I am fully aware that there are also misunderstandings can be tremendously costly things. It's not something to be taken quite so lightly as perhaps I'm making it sound. But I am really interested in the sort of failures of communication as something that can be generative and productive, and in fact even kind of full of the most wonderful kind of awkwardness as one facet of what can happen. It's not to ignore the other, like I said, dire consequences of that. But those are often things I find myself very magnetically drawn to, which I work with. Okay, so I'm just being really long-winded, and I wonder if I should maybe skip this. I'll tell you in very brief form. I won't show you too many examples, but there are two projects that the next two I'm going to talk about are ones that are ongoing, and which I started not thinking they would be 23-year-long projects like this one, but which I find myself adding to often. And the basic idea here was that I spent a week in a library. This library was just a book collection in someone's home. It wasn't a library, lending library. And I got very interested in this couple's books. They had been married for about 5 years. They were both in their 40s at the time, and they had merged their libraries. So there were a lot of books where you could see the sort of interests of these two people overlapping and sometimes converging and sometimes being wildly different. And I just decided to start arranging the books so that if you read the titles in order, you would end up with these short phrases, poems, riddles, stories. They had a lot of Shakespeare and self-help. So things like Romeo and Juliet, They Rose Above It, Codependent No More. That happened. Hamlet, What's Eating You? Hey Man, Open Up and Live. This came from the Akron Art Museum library, where they had a research library that no one ever really saw because it was behind the scenes. And primitive art, just imagine Picasso raised by wolves, was one of the phrases that came out of that. Every time I do a book sorting, I end up, depends how much time I have in the book collection, but I end up making like maybe between 15 and at the upper level, maybe 100 different of these book clusters. This was from the home of Linda Pace, who was an art collector in San Antonio, who started a place called Art Pace. This, in some sense, serves as the motto, not maybe for just this project, but for a lot of things that I do, which I really sort of like the idea of art as, when it really comes down to it, all are forms of close observation of something. Whether you are, you know, an abstract painter, someone who thinks about color, and you could sort of think about it as a close observation of that. But all of these things are, I sort of feel like my job is to observe closely and then report the findings again and again. I did a project in the Delaware Art Museum with a historical collection of books that were from the turn of the century and which were tremendously beautiful. So I worked with these books covers up. If Youth But Knew the Old Knowledge at the Time Appointed was one. Somewhere in France, the Anglomaniacs Meet the Germans. There were a lot of books about travel. Friendship, The Silent Places Where Speech Ends. And some of these were sort of more poetic, a little bit melancholic, maybe like this one. Indian History for Young Folks, Our Village, Your National Parks. The Lost Word Drifted in Uncanonized. I got to make a book of the books 3 years ago, which was really fun, and this book has since sort of already become a little out of date because there have been a few new installments of the project. And one of the most exciting was this one. Kansas Cutup is the name of the series, which I got to do in the personal book collection of William S. Burroughs, the American writer. His reputation tends to precede him. He is a very, very a very interesting character. You can love him, you can hate him, but most people know a little of the mythology about him, which is that he was, you know, a heavy drug user, experimented with tons of things, traveled, had, you know, a very sort of like polymorphous sexuality. He was sort of all over the place with many different things. Very curious, very smart, brilliant man. Maybe not the easiest person. Shot his wife by mistake, etc., etc., etc. This is his cat graveyard at the back of his house. He was a total cat freak, and the last 16 years of his life lived in Lawrence, Kansas, in this bucolic little setting. And I was allowed to work with his books, which the archive had not actually looked at terribly carefully yet. So what was sort of exciting here for me is that I went through his books for the first time quite thoroughly and in some ways helped them with the archiving of this. So they brought out about 60 boxes of books. I opened every one, looked through every single one, devised a system, this is always the way I work, where I make lists of the titles first that I think could be useful, and then from the lists I transcribe titles onto index cards and then move the index cards around until I have clusters that I think might work, and then I go and pull the books to kind of see how they look. Here's a snapshot of one of his bookshelves. And this is not untypical. You could have the handgun reloading manual next to Was Mozart Poisoned, next to The Domestic Cat, like these kind of, you know, whiplash moments of subject matter. Very disturbing books like these would sometimes materialize, and I would sort of sit there going, do I really want to see what's in this book? Do I really want to open? Do I really want to see the table of contents here? And I had very disturbing dreams the week that I worked there. It was amazing and interesting and strange all at once. These two books came out of the box in this order: Metallic Silhouette Shooting and How to Massage Your Cat. So I made a lot of cat book clusters because I love cats, actually. And so Cats, Holy Terror, Hostage to the Devil, Monsters Among Us Passing for Human, American Diplomacy, Physical Interrogation Techniques in the Secret State. And then this book showed up, Nerve. He loved reading this kind of genre of sort of cheap medical paperback thrillers. He loved these books. There were tons of them. And he often wrote in them. He often made commentary when the book was over. He would sort of rant about how bad the plot was. And it was amazing reading all his marginalia. But Nerve had this hole in it that I didn't really know what to make of this. Like, what is this? And I opened it up, and he had shot the book. So here's the bullet. How did sex begin? Uninvited guests, human error. And then I decided I had to make one giant book stack with all of the medical thrillers I could work into one place. So Burroughs was notoriously afraid of hospitals. He hated doctors. He hated hospitals. If you read Naked Lunch, you might remember a character, Dr. Benway, who's this kind of monster. And so anyway, this was my attempt to do that. So the hospital, nurse, just a nurse, the nurses, the doctors, a pride of healers, medical murderers in cold blood. Fever, mutation, contagion, outbreak, pandemic, quarantine, last words, brain dead, stone dead. And this stack was so huge we had to actually hold it up with a fire extinguisher behind it. And finally, only yesterday, I left my grandfather's house. Flashback. I left my grandfather's house. I left my grandfather's house. Flashbacks. He loved this author, Denton Welch, who I had never heard of. He was a British author, sort of pre-turn of the century, and had tons of books by him, but also lots of copies of the same book by him. So that leaves me with the last project I'm going to address at length, Seed Assignment, which is another ongoing project, which I also don't think I can say I started it knowing I would be working on it years later. But as someone who believes in the potential of the everyday, as someone who believes in the idea that there's usually more than meets the eye, and that, you know, art can kind of happen in a lot of unlikely places, I found myself one day sitting down for a flight from New York to Atlanta. And yeah, I thought, here I am on a plane again, with sort of 2.5 hours ahead of me, and, you know, this time is kind of dead already. Like, nothing's going to happen between now and then. It's just, I've already written it off. And I thought, that's bad. Like, why am I doing that as someone who thinks that, you know, all kinds of situations can end up being interesting? So I said, why don't I just try to make work, whatever that's going to mean in this situation, the whole way to Atlanta? Like, I'll furiously make things. And what I had to work with was my cell phone, and I had the in-flight magazine, and I had snacks they passed out, and whatever else was around me, and I just kind of set to work. And by the time I got to Atlanta, a lot had actually happened, and I thought, you know, I don't know that any of these images are really that great, but I thought I should just keep doing this and sort of see where it leads. And so now, 6 years later, flying here on Sunday, I haven't actually totally figured this out, but I think it was flight number 180 since I've started the project. So I've been doing this for years, and I've taken hundreds and hundreds of pictures, and a lot of stuff has happened. So I'll kind of give you like a whirlwind tour of Seed Assignment, but this is one from the second flight ever. So plastic straw in the drink, picture of a golf course in the in-flight magazine, and then overhead light that kind of makes this shadow. And, you know, I think of this as some kind of utopian bridge or rainbow, maybe. Pretzels are very useful. You can crumble them up, put them on tiny pictures in the in-flight magazine, and create landslides, or like meteor hits the Earth sci-fi moment, glacier structures. Sandwiches can chase people down ski slopes. What I'm happy about with this picture is that the cabin light, which casts the sandwich shadow, matches the light in the picture, and that sort of makes those two things feel like they're sort of there, same place. There are a lot of outdoor adventure pictures, in part because these in-flight magazines are constantly selling you this kind of like, travel more, exciting adventures abound, await you ahead, and so there's a lot of that inducing you to travel. And they never feed you on planes anymore, so I'm always bringing my own food, and I had a hard-boiled egg on this flight. Very fond recently of pictures from newspapers because they have this very matte surface texture. So this was from the New York Times. It was a dance review. And you never get those swords, well, you know, not often in the lemon wedge, but I love those like little things. I had to use that for something. Sugar can be very useful, messy, but useful. I've made a few animations. This is called Sugar Fox, which is a picture from National Geographic with, I sort of held the camera with one hand and poked the sugar with the other, and then, like a stop-action animation, joined these up. So it kind of inhales and exhales. It's sugar cloud. There's a whole series called High Altitude Spirit Photography, where I'm thinking about the tradition of spirit photography from the 19th century, where people were sort of trying to capture ghosts and spirits in the image, and this really is here a sort of shortcoming of the camera zone way of seeing the picture, of sort of seeing this glare, so over-defined. So people get materialized and birds catch on fire. And this is a technique I've gotten really into lately, which involves having a very bright seat by the window, lifting up a magazine page, and sort of blasting the light through a piece of paper where there are images on both sides that merge when you do that. So I never know what I'm going to find. This was an ancient city on one side and a modern city on the other, and they just happen to show up this way. So I'm always in the window seat reading the magazine sideways. Or this man who became this kind of elfin, I don't know, the troll of Eaton Terrace. I don't know who he is. This is like the mountain cult or something like that. It's painful to be American sometimes. This one I made just a few weeks ago, and it's one of my favorites in this group now, I think. This was a car ad on one side and a picture from the Monterey Bay Aquarium on the other of this sort of fish like swimming around a corner, and somehow this looks like to me like a ghostly blast from down the road. I think a lot about things that can go wrong, tumors and body things and smoking saunas that you're stuck inside of. That sweater lint from my scarf. Engines that can catch on fire, or more sweater lint here. And then, there are these kinds of events, which are kind of in our cultural image bank now of things that can go wrong. And this was a weird image to make. This was about 2 weeks before the 10-year 9/11 anniversary. And in New York, we hear this phrase constantly, if you see something, say something. And I really, in this moment, thought, I really hope this doesn't look like anything to the person sitting next to me, because this is a strange image to be making right now. And I get asked a lot about what the person next to me says. I can tell you, on 170 flights, there have been exactly 3 questions ever from anybody. So either they don't notice, they don't care, they don't want to know, or I'd like to think it's also partially because I'm being sort of stealthy with my picture taking. I look like a bored person with a phone. And that is at the same time my alibi for doing what I'm doing. I'm just bored. And it also is exactly the thing I'm trying not to be. I'm trying to be really engaged and sort of optimistic about what potential this space has. There's a series called Provisional Shelters. So this is like a place you might spend the night in a hostile landscape if the plane were a wilderness. That's like Antarctica, maybe. She's hut. I like to build these, I think of these as log piles, especially when I have a kind of manly man hand next to me, and I build them in the drink well. They're magazine subscription cards that are that sort of harder, thicker cardboard, and you roll them up and they tend to keep their shape. And then I make clocks in the drink well, which are, to me, kind of the time space of the airplane, really. Like, it's kind of where and when you are on the plane. I do very formal studies of the wing. This is part of a series called Window Seat Suprematism, where I'm thinking about suprematist collage and these kind of flat moments. So it's funny the way that, art history kind of pops up for me in ways that I don't expect. I recognize things that really have nothing to do with the airplane, but they have to do with museums I've been to, maybe. Proposals for public sculpture. So here's very corporate, kind of front of the building thing, minimalist, big outdoor. I was thinking of Storm King outside of New York City here. Those are 2 lifesavers that I sucked down into tiny, thin loops. St. Louis Arch-ish, maybe, lemon wedge. A bunch of green peas that I was snacking on one flight that I found worked pretty well in this ornamental garden in Lake Como, Italy. That's a sweater gorilla that I made in my lap. And that's a sweater gibbon that I made in my lap, so these sweater animals. The belt buckle can be very useful too, and you can reflect things, sort of double things in the picture. I think of this as a butterfly. This is a centaur. I spent an entire flight once with just the cocktail napkin to see if I could sort of even limit myself more and do a lot of things with just one material, and a lot of things happen there. This is called Ascension, as sort of the art historical category of, going to heaven, and here we have a sad dog from the SkyMall catalog that's a little too old to get on the bed easily. So they made these ramps for them, which I love the SkyMall catalog. And that's a tea bag string that became his halo. You can also spy on people in the belt buckle. So you can use it as a kind of lens to look at things around you. So this was the guy sitting next to me, who luckily didn't notice. And then I've started sort of puncturing the image a lot lately with my finger, trying to kind of, I don't know what these are yet, really, but that's a sick finger in surgery. And then I had this opportunity to do a show. The first opportunity to do a show that involved this work was in New Zealand, where I got the most amazing residency I've ever gotten to do. Was in New Zealand in 2011 for 5 weeks. And the idea was the residency would lead to a show. And I said to them, I'm a year into this project called Seat Assignment, where I make work on planes. I have a 20-hour flight to get to you guys. So I propose that I make the show on the plane. Will you let me try to do that? And they were very brave, I think, to say yes, but they said, sure, okay, see what happens. And then, of course, the pressure was really on. So you can see my route, that's how I went. And I didn't really know much about what I would do on this flight. I try not to plan ahead too much. It's sort of in the spirit of don't make it too easy. It's a project that I often talk about as one where the question of how freedom and constraint kind of meet one another is very much at the core. So I'm not allowed to pack my bag with props and fancy things and things that will make it really easy to make a cool picture. And what ended up happening there were sort of 3 sections to the show. And here you're sort of moving out of the first gallery, which worked a little bit like a natural history museum. There was a whole series of birds of New Zealand on the wall and other kinds of imagery that were about sort of nature and landscape. And then you came into this gallery where the mood changed very suddenly. There was this kind of red color and things that I hoped read like paintings. And as you got closer to them, they revealed themselves to be not paintings, but photographs. And they were made in the airplane bathroom on the way to New Zealand, using stuff I found in the bathroom. So same rules, only what I find, have to kind of do it fast, take the picture, go back to my seat, and then I would sort of think about what I had and revisit it and make more. And, this was a 14-hour leg when most people were asleep. They didn't care who was in the bathroom, what they were doing. And I had opportunity to make a lot of pictures in there, so I did. I was really productive on this flight. I made a lot of things besides these, but this to me was sort of about, how can I sort of inhabit these different people, these different characters. As you now know, there's nothing Flemish about me at all. So it makes me laugh when people say, well, you really look like those paintings. I really don't look like those paintings. I don't look like those paintings. I look like someone affecting the look of those paintings. I'm not doing anything fancy with the lighting. You can see sometimes the naked wall of the bathroom is behind me. Other times I've hung up this black travel scarf that I have, and I'm using a red travel blanket. Paper napkins. I mean, I hope these sort of are, there should be something sort of very transparent about what every picture really involves. And what's interesting to me is how sort of readily people seem to be able to kind of make the leap to these images they've seen before. This one is not Flemish. The art history geek in me, it bothers me that this one really should be cordoned off and be called Spanish Baroque or something else. It's not. It's just not, it's not spare enough to be Flemish. I was very, very jet lagged on this flight. And I think what people often read as sort of melancholia or, contemplation is just really serious jet lag. I'm so tired there that I kind of can't. I almost walked out wearing the collar at one point. So I made a lot of these, and they've had a strange and viral life online. Has anyone seen these before coming here? Yeah, it's been really strange and interesting for me to kind of contend with that. These photos kind of ran away from the rest of the project, which is very nice. It's very nice that people are enthusiastic and that they have shown all this kind of interest in these. At the same time, the internet has a way of kind of reducing art to one big prank, and that's been problematic for me. I've had to many times say, there's sort of more to it than just weird lady goes into the bathroom and does this thing. I don't mind it being humorous, as you would probably guess I would feel that way. But I do want the sort of broader conversation about what it means to work under pressure, what it means to work with almost nothing, and all the other stuff I've been talking about. So I've been trying to kind of bring these people back into the rest of the project. An elementary school in California did this kind of crazy homage thing, and this teacher sent me this picture, which I really, really love. And many strangers have tried their hand at this. I get pictures from kind strangers all the time in airplane bathrooms who have sort of tried to do their own version of this. And I mean, that's very delightful to me. I like that, yeah, you can try it too. So, and I've made a few music videos in the bathroom, which I am not going to, I'm going to sort of wait to the Q&A to, if you want to see it, I'll show it to you then, but I'm going to, time allowing, maybe we'll go back to this, but yeah, that's happened also. So then I wanted to tell you about this week, because this has been an amazing week. The last few days working with Signal Return Press in Detroit. And this wonderful thing came together where Armenian Studies and the Institute for the Humanities and Signal Return, all of us sort of coalesced around this idea that we could make a print that would somehow have a connection to something Armenian related. And I have not made many prints in my life ever. I mean, I don't make prints alone ever. I don't know how to, but I've gotten to work with people who do. And this was an opportunity like that again. So I want to sort of tell you one last family story, and that's really the end of my talk. This person who's tremendously important to me was Lucy. And Lucy was a genocide orphan. We don't know Lucy's real name. We don't know where she was born, when she was born. We don't know anything about her true identity. But what we know is that she was in an orphanage after the war years ended, and that my father's parents were sort of prevailed upon to help one of these Armenian orphans. They didn't have children yet themselves. And so they were sort of pretty arm-twisted to, you know, please give this girl a home, give her a place, you know, she can help you in the house. I mean, this sort of ambiguous role of like, not exactly an adopted daughter, but, you know, someone who could sort of be there and help. And they didn't have kids yet, but they hoped to have children. And, you know, maybe once they did have children, this could be a person who would help raise their child, like a nanny, and so on. So she came into my father's family that way. And when my father was born, she became like his second mother. And, you know, much more than sort of a nanny. Really, she was like a second mother to him and really like a grandmother to me. I always called her my bonus third grandmother because I grew up with her as a completely full family member. But her story is a tremendously, you know, tragic one. And we have very few things from her life before she came into my family, but one of those objects that came with her when she moved into my grandparents' home was this. This is a tiny, like about this big, embroidery sampler that she made in the orphanage. She was probably about 10, 11 years old, and these girls in these orphanages were being taught things like needlework to hopefully make them, you know, employable, to make them useful somewhere, to provide some skills that they could sort of like try to make a life out of. And so this is her practicing and practicing. I mean, a 10 or 11-year-old girl like bending over these stitches. And it is so amazing to me that this object has survived. It's my mother framed this and gave it to me many Christmases ago, and I've had it on my wall for a very long time. But when this invitation came up, I thought it would be really interesting to work with something that had to do with Lucy, because she deserves it, and because my family story sort of would feel incomplete if I didn't at some point also make a piece about her. And this is actually the first time that that's felt right to do. So I've brought this to Detroit, and we spent the last 2 days deeply embroiled in this object. And what we're trying to do, here are a few details of it, just so you can kind of see how hard she has worked on this. What we are trying to do is to, in some sense, replicate this. And I'm doing it by making an engraving on a piece of plexiglass, by literally tracing every single stitch that she made with different kinds of tools, with little tools that scrape and other tools that sort of drill, and Dremels and engraving tools. And it has been like revisiting every one of her lines. It's been a whole sort of 48 hours of thinking about Lucy for me, and thinking about her life, what it meant to make this object, the whole circumstance of history, all of it. And so the wonderful Lee Marcellones, who's the master printer there, has been working her tail off the last few days helping me work this out. And we are both pleasantly in the same category of we can get really obsessive about it. So we have been trying to get the exact color of the fabric right, and I've been trying to get all the stitches really perfect, and we have been pulling prints and making samples and working on this. And By the end of today, I would say we've gotten to a point where we know we're going to get this to work out. We've got a really good sample print, and now it's about sort of fine-tuning that. And so that's where we're headed. And there will be an edition of this available down the line. So I hope you will stay tuned on that. I'm very excited about it. So that's it. That's where I'm going to stop. These are things I'm currently working on. I'm happy to answer questions, and I can answer questions about any one of these things or anything I just talked about or anything else you're curious about. And I just want to say thanks again for having me. It's been really nice to be here. So.